Bruce Lee entered a private gym challenge. 9 seconds later, the room witnessed a legendary feat. 9 seconds after Bruce Lee stepped onto the gym floor, the challenge was already over. No one shouted. No one moved. What ended the room was not force, not speed, and not spectacle. Witnesses would later agree on only one thing. Whatever happened in those seconds could not be repeated, and did not need to be explained. The man who issued the challenge never trained the same way again. And the room, quiet long before the door closed, kept the memory intact. The gym was not marked from the street. No sign announced its presence. Those who came here already knew where it was. It occupied the second floor of an aging commercial building, its windows partially obscured by dust and years of neglect. Inside, the air carried the mixed scent of iron, canvas, and old sweat, familiar to anyone who had spent enough time proving themselves without witnesses who mattered. This was not a place for beginners, and it was not a place for explanations. The room had rules, though none were written. You did not ask how long someone had trained. You did not interrupt another man's work. And you did not issue a challenge unless you were prepared to accept what followed, whatever form it took. Most of the men here had built their confidence slowly, through repetition and comparison. Strength was measured by what others could see. Weight lifted, bodies moved, endurance displayed over time. Respect followed visibility. The louder the effort, the clearer the hierarchy. At one end of the room stood a small group, regulars who trained at the same hours, who had tested each other enough to settle their places without further discussion. They spoke quietly, if at all. In spaces like this, conversation was a distraction. Observation carried more weight. It was within this environment that the idea of a challenge formed. Not suddenly and not from impulse. The challenger had been here long enough to feel established. His technique was recognized. His confidence reinforced daily by nods and deference from those who came after him. In rooms like this, that kind of validation can begin to feel permanent. But permanence invites examination. The challenge itself was never announced formally. There was no declaration, no raised voice. It passed through the room the way such things always did, through glances, half-sentences, and expectation. A test was coming. The question was not whether it would happen, but who would be present when it did. When Bruce Lee entered, there was no immediate reaction. He did not carry himself as someone arriving to prove a point. He wore simple training clothes, unremarkable in cut and color. He did not survey the room. He did not search for attention. Those closest to him would later recall that he seemed more interested in the floor beneath his feet than the men watching him. This too was noted. The rules of the room adjusted quietly, the way they always did when something unfamiliar entered the space. Conversations stopped. Movements slowed. The atmosphere did not grow tense so much as focused, as if everyone understood that whatever happened next would define the room long after the equipment was replaced and the walls repainted. No one intervened. No one clarified terms. In this gym, authority was never declared. It was revealed, and everyone present understood that the reveal was imminent. Bruce Lee did not acknowledge the room when he arrived, and the room did not rush to acknowledge him. That balance held for several moments, long enough for those present to measure the situation without words. In places like this, recognition is never immediate. It is earned through time or taken through consequence. The challenger was already there. He was not the largest man in the room, but he was the most settled. His presence carried the confidence of repetition, years of being tested without being undone. He had sparred here, demonstrated here, corrected others here. When disagreements arose, his interpretations of technique often ended the discussion. Not because he insisted, but because no one had yet forced him to reconsider. This was the authority he trusted. He noticed Bruce Lee the way experienced fighters notice change, without obvious reaction, but with quiet recalibration. Lee's build did not threaten him. Lean frames were common here, especially among those who relied on speed. There was nothing outwardly exceptional to provoke caution. What unsettled him was the absence of performance. Bruce Lee did not stretch for attention. He did not shadowbox. He did not test the floor with exaggerated footwork. He moved with efficiency only where necessary, each adjustment small and purposeful, as though conserving something others could not see. Witnesses later described this as restraint, though at the time it registered as indifference. The challenger approached without hostility. His tone was controlled, familiar, shaped by years of being deferred to. The words exchanged were minimal, enough to establish intent, not enough to invite debate. There was no insult. None was needed. The challenge existed simply because the room expected it to. Bruce Lee listened. He did not interrupt. When he responded, it was brief, almost dismissive in its simplicity. Not dismissive of the man, dismissive of the necessity to elaborate. This too shifted the atmosphere. Authority in such spaces often depends on rhythm, the ability to dictate tempo, to force reactions. The challenger was accustomed to this. He set the pace of exchanges. Others adjusted around him. Bruce Lee did not adjust. He neither rushed nor delayed. He accepted the premise without adopting its urgency. The challenger, perhaps without realizing it, had already surrendered control of timing. The room sensed this before it could articulate why. Positions were taken without ceremony. No crowd formed, but everyone angled themselves toward the center, pretending not to watch while missing nothing. There was an unspoken agreement among them. Whatever occurred would be allowed to finish. Bruce Lee stood relaxed, his posture upright but unguarded. Not loose, not tense. Balanced. The challenger assumed a familiar stance, one that had served him well against others. His weight distribution reflected confidence in patterns that had never failed him here. The difference between them was subtle but decisive. One man was prepared to demonstrate skill. The other was prepared to end the need for demonstration. No signal was given. No count was agreed upon. The room held its breath, not in anticipation, but in recognition that something irreversible had already begun. The room did not grow louder as the moment approached. It grew still. Those who had been leaning against the walls straightened without realizing it. A man near the heavy bag paused mid-adjustment and let the strap fall from his hands. Even breathing seemed to slow, as though sound itself might interfere with what was about to happen. No one spoke because no one needed to. The challenge had reached the stage where words would only dilute it. The challenger was aware of the attention now. He had felt it many times before, this quiet gathering of focus. Usually it sharpened him. Usually it confirmed his position. This time it felt different, less like reinforcement, more like inspection. Bruce Lee remained unchanged. Witnesses would later struggle to describe what he was doing in those seconds before movement. Some said he was watching the challenger's shoulders. Others believed he was listening to breathing patterns. A few insisted he was not focused on the man at all, but on the space between them. What they agreed on was this: he was not preparing in the way they understood preparation. The challenger shifted his stance slightly, a small adjustment meant to reassert comfort. It was a habit, one that had always worked. The floor creaked faintly beneath his foot. That sound carried farther than expected. The silence absorbed it. Time in the room began to feel uneven. Not slowed, but stretched, each second expanding under scrutiny. Those watching became acutely aware of their own positions, their own vulnerabilities. Challenges have a way of doing that. They remind observers that hierarchy is not theoretical. This was no longer about two men. It was about the stability of what everyone believed they understood. Bruce Lee's expression did not change. There was no narrowing of the eyes, no visible calculation. His face was calm in a way that resisted interpretation. Not confidence, not arrogance, something closer to acceptance. The challenger, by contrast, was now fully present. His focus sharpened, his muscles engaged. He was ready to act, ready to respond. Readiness had always been his advantage. What he did not recognize was that readiness assumes exchange. And exchange was not coming. The room reached a point of quiet so complete that later witnesses would describe it as pressure, an almost physical sensation, as though the air itself had weight. No one moved away. No one stepped in. They were not waiting for action. They were waiting for confirmation. And in that suspended moment, before anything visibly occurred, some in the room would later admit they already knew how it would end. Not because they foresaw the method, but because they sensed the imbalance. One man was still thinking in terms of effort. The other had already finished thinking. The demonstration, when it came, would not announce itself. It would simply remove the need for further watching. No one could later agree on the exact moment it began. There was no signal, no shift dramatic enough to mark a clear start. What witnesses described instead was a sudden absence, the disappearance of expectation. One instant the challenger was set, prepared to act or counter. The next, the situation had already moved beyond him. Bruce Lee stepped forward once. Not aggressively, not hurried. The movement was economical, almost modest, as though it belonged to a different activity entirely. Those watching would later say the step itself seemed to shorten the distance in the room more than it should have, compressing space rather than crossing it. What followed took seconds. Some would insist it was fewer. There was no exchange of combinations, no testing of defenses, no escalation. Bruce Lee did not probe. He did not measure. He did not adjust after contact, because adjustment was unnecessary. The action was singular. Witnesses struggled to describe it because it lacked familiar markers. There was no visible wind-up, no exaggerated strike. The challenger did not fall dramatically, nor was he thrown across the room. What happened looked, to the untrained eye, almost incomplete. Yet the effect was absolute. The challenger's structure collapsed, not violently, but decisively. His balance vanished as though it had been removed rather than broken. His body reacted before his understanding could. One moment he was upright. The next, he was no longer in control of where his weight was going. Bruce Lee had already stopped moving. By the time the challenger registered what had occurred, Lee was standing still again, his posture unchanged from moments before. There was no follow-through to admire, no pose to read as triumph. The demonstration had ended the instant it achieved its purpose. The room remained silent. It was not shock that held them, but recalibration. What they had just seen did not fit within the frameworks they relied on. Speed alone could not explain it. Strength did not account for it. Technique, as they understood the word, seemed insufficient. The challenger did not attempt to recover position. He did not rise quickly or shake it off. He remained where he was, not injured in any obvious way, but altered. The difference was visible in his stillness. Bruce Lee waited only long enough to confirm there was nothing further required of him. He did not look around the room. He did not seek acknowledgement. The demonstration had not been for the audience. It had been for the moment. Those present would later realize something else, something that unsettled them more than the speed or efficiency. Bruce Lee had not escalated to match resistance. He had acted at the exact level needed to end the challenge, and no more. There had been no struggle, only resolution. And with that resolution, the room understood that the challenge had not failed. It had been rendered unnecessary. The challenger remained on the floor longer than expected. Not because he was hurt, but because standing would have implied something that no longer applied. Those closest to him could see the change in his breathing. Not labored, not panicked, simply recalibrated, as though his body was adjusting to a new set of conclusions. When he finally rose, it was without urgency. He did not test his footing. He did not shake out his arms. These were habits of recovery, gestures meant to reassert continuity. Instead, he stood carefully, almost respectfully, as if mindful of a boundary that had just been drawn. Bruce Lee did not move to meet him. He did not offer instruction or correction. He did not explain what had happened. Explanation would have suggested the need for interpretation, and there was none. The collapse had not been physical. It was structural. The challenger's posture had changed. His shoulders no longer sat forward with ownership of the space. His eyes did not search for validation from the room. He looked briefly at Bruce Lee, not with resentment, not with disbelief, but with a quiet acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted. No one laughed. No one spoke. This silence was different from the one before. That silence had been full of anticipation. This one carried understanding. The room had absorbed the outcome, and with it, a revision of its internal hierarchy. A challenge typically produces ripples. Debates, reinterpretations, excuses offered softly for the sake of dignity. None of that followed here. There was nothing to argue against. The demonstration had been too brief, too clean to attach narrative defenses to. The challenger stepped back. Not dramatically, not ceremonially. He simply removed himself from the center of the room, yielding space without being asked. It was an instinctive action, one he might not have consciously chosen, but one that felt correct nonetheless. Bruce Lee picked up his training bag. That detail would be remembered more than any strike. The ease with which he returned to ordinary movement unsettled those watching. There was no visible satisfaction, no sense of completion. It was as though the challenge had been a minor interruption rather than a defining moment. As he moved toward the edge of the room, eyes followed him. Not in admiration, but in reassessment. The men present were recalculating their own assumptions, not about Bruce Lee, but about themselves. The challenger did not speak again that day. Neither did Bruce Lee. But the psychological dominance had already settled into place. Not through assertion, but through removal. Something had been taken away, not confidence entirely, but certainty. And certainty, once gone, does not return easily. The room resumed its routines slowly. Weights were lifted again. Bags were struck. But the rhythm had changed. Everyone felt it. The challenge was over, but its effect had only begun. The gym did not last. Buildings like that rarely do. Ownership changed. Equipment was sold. The second floor was eventually repurposed, the windows cleaned, the smell of iron replaced with something more neutral, more forgettable. New people passed through the space without knowing what had once occurred there. But the story stayed. It was not told loudly. It was never written down. Those who spoke of it did so only when the listener already understood how to listen. The details shifted slightly with each retelling, not the outcome but the framing. Some said it was 8 seconds. Others insisted it was closer to 10. No one argued about the difference. Time had never been the point. What endured was the manner. Men who had been present that day trained differently afterward. Subtly at first. Their movements became smaller. Their emphasis shifted from accumulation to efficiency. They asked fewer questions about strength and more about position, timing, and intention. Not openly, quietly. The challenger remained a fixture in similar rooms for years. He continued to train, continued to teach. But those who knew him before and after could see the distinction. He no longer positioned himself as a test for others. He no longer invited comparison. When asked about that day, he rarely answered directly. When he did, it was brief. "He didn't take anything from me," he would say. "He showed me what I didn't need." Bruce Lee never referenced the challenge publicly. There was no record of it in interviews, no anecdote offered for context or legacy. That omission was consistent with how he lived. What mattered to him was not the memory of dominance, but the refinement that followed demonstration. Years later, when his influence had expanded far beyond private gyms and closed rooms, Some of those witnesses would recognize familiar principles in his public work, not as explanations but as continuations. Economy of motion, adaptability without display, power expressed only at the moment it was required. They understood then that the challenge had not been an exception. It had been a glimpse. The legend that formed around the incident did not celebrate victory. It did not dwell on defeat. Instead, it carried a quieter message, one that resisted simplification. That true authority does not announce itself. That mastery does not seek confirmation. That the most decisive actions often leave the least evidence behind. In time, the story became a reference point rather than a spectacle. Older practitioners would mention it when younger ones mistook noise for effectiveness. Not as a warning, but as a reminder that there are levels of understanding that do not reveal themselves through effort alone. And when the telling ended, it always ended the same way, with a pause. Not because there was more to say, but because those listening needed time to sit with what could not be imitated, only understood.